There are neighborhoods where the grass grows too perfectly, where the fences are always freshly painted, and where every mailbox matches like soldiers in a parade. Brookstone Ridge was one of those places. A place that didn't feel lived in. It felt curated. On paper, it was a suburban paradise. But to anyone who'd spent time here, it was clear. Peace in Brookstone Ridge came at the cost of conformity. And the woman enforcing it all was Barbara Evans, the HO vice president, unofficial watchdog, and full-time tyrant with a clipboard. Mason Parker had grown used to her nonsense. He lived here. He learned how to smile politely at her passive-aggressive flyers, ignore her porch inspections, and quietly fix the violations she dropped off like landmines wrapped in envelopes. But when the knock came that morning, he knew immediately it wasn't about him this time. It was about his brother. Logan Parker had returned from active duty just a week earlier. 14 years in uniform. Multiple deployments. Enough medals to make a general nod in respect, and enough trauma to make anyone crave silence. That's what he came here for. Peace. Familiarity. Family. But Brookstone Ridge didn't make space for people like Logan. Barbara Evans showed up at 7:03 a.m., flanked by her shadow, a thick HOA manual held tight to her chest, as if it doubled as a moral compass. "We need to talk," she said, not even bothering with a greeting. Mason barely masked his irritation. "Barbara, it's 7 in the morning. Some of us aren't powered by rage and decaf." She handed him a folded paper, stamped in red with that unmistakable HOA seal, like a declaration of war in bureaucratic form. "It's your brother," she said, her tone cold as marble. "He's been repeatedly seen wearing camouflage attire in community spaces. It's disruptive, and frankly, intimidating to residents." Mason blinked. "You're writing him up for his pants?" Barbara didn't flinch. "This neighborhood values aesthetic harmony." Mason stared at her for a long second, then said slowly, "You know he's an active duty soldier, right?" "Irrelevant," she snapped. "The rules apply to everyone." He closed the door without another word. Inside, Logan stood in the kitchen, pouring coffee like a man trying to recreate normalcy one drop at a time. Mason slid the letter across the table. Logan read it. "Then read it again." "They've got a problem with Camo?" "No, they've got a problem with what it represents," Mason replied. Logan said nothing, but the look in his eyes said everything. Later that day, he walked out the front door in tactical boots, full fatigues, and a beret, just to check the mailbox. He didn't speak. He didn't wave. But the message was clear. "You want a war over this uniform? Then you better bring more than a clipboard." At precisely 7:42 a.m., the sliding glass door creaked open, and Logan Parker stepped onto the dew-covered lawn like a soldier emerging from fog. He wore full military fatigues, the insignia on his arm clear and precise, his beret sitting snug over cropped hair. His boots left clean imprints across the neatly edged grass that the HOA deemed heritage grade, as if the soil itself required pedigree. He didn't say a word. He simply walked down the driveway with the quiet purpose of a man who had once marched into villages laced with landmines. But today's mission was domestic. Retrieve the morning paper and, by sheer presence, detonate Brookstone Ridge's obsession with uniformity. Mrs. Calhoun, the widow across the street, froze mid-spritz while watering her petunias, blinking behind cat-eye glasses. Two teenage skateboarders, usually immune to suburban drama, stopped dead in their tracks, one whispering, "Dude, is that a real soldier?" But the real target of the operation was already in position. Barbara Evans. Perched on her front steps in a lemon-hued cardigan that matched her mood, she clutched her phone like a detonator. Her lips pursed so tight they nearly disappeared into her face. Logan offered a single nod. Not a smile. Not a wave. Just acknowledgement. Barbara stormed across the street like a wind-up doll on a mission. "This is an escalation," she barked. Logan tilted his head innocently. "I thought we were enforcing dress codes." "This is not funny." "You're right. Community violations are a serious matter." Barbara's hands trembled slightly as she raised her phone. "I'm documenting this." Logan gave her a textbook-perfect salute. "Make sure to get my good side." It was the first shot in a Cold War fought with passive-aggressive flyers and photocopied bylaws. Later that afternoon, Mason found Logan in the backyard, manning the grill like a battlefield cookout. Smoke curled upward from sizzling steaks, the air thick with mesquite and quiet defiance. "They issued another letter," Mason said, waving the document. Logan flipped a ribeye with surgical precision. "She's doubling down. They're calling for a formal review. Possible fine." "Good," Logan said. Mason raised an eyebrow. "You keep saying that." "Because the more she pushes, the more she exposes herself." And she did. Within 48 hours, Barbara flooded inboxes with HOA newsletters containing thinly veiled condemnations. She even posted a laminated flyer to the community bulletin board titled "Appropriate Attire for Neighborhood Unity." It featured silhouettes of casual khakis, neutral blouses, and a bold red X slashed across anything resembling camouflage. But Logan didn't bite. He marched, figuratively and literally, through the week. He walked the dog in fatigues. He attended his niece's soccer game in a black operations jacket. He wore a desert-patterned uniform while grabbing milk at the store. And at every turn, the residents watched. Not with disdain, but with a curiosity Barbara hadn't predicted. A cashier at the local grocery saluted him. A Vietnam vet down the block gave a subtle thumbs up. "Barbara?" She called store security. Twice. One of them recognized Logan's unit patch. The man stood a little straighter and addressed him as Sir. Barbara stormed out red-faced, muttering about maintaining standards. What she didn't realize, what she couldn't comprehend, was that Logan's presence was no longer the disruption. It was her. Mason sat with Logan on the porch one night, both sipping cold beers beneath a sky unbothered by HOA regulations. "You know she's not going to let this go," Mason said. "She doesn't have to," Logan replied. "I already won." Mason cocked his head. "How do you figure?" "She tried to shame me," Logan said, his voice even. "But now the neighborhood sees me. Not as a threat. As a reminder. That peace doesn't come from bylaws. It comes from those willing to defend it." And then came the HOA meeting. The Brookstone Ridge Community Center was sterile by design. Beige walls, plastic chairs, a faint scent of lemon cleaner and denial. It was a space built not for comfort, but for control, where smiles were forced and minutes were taken like confessions in a suburban church. That evening, however, it would host something far more explosive than any HOA budget dispute. Logan and Mason arrived early, not to make a scene, but because Logan believed in being prepared. Always had. Barbara Evans, flanked by her loyal disciples, namely Susan Gardner and Mr. Edwin Henderson, sat at the head of the folding table, her clipboard thicker than ever. Behind her were stacks of papers, color-coded binders, and laminated rules that had become her shield and sword for years. The room filled slowly, not with the usual murmurs about tree trimming and recycling bins, but with tension. Residents whispered. They weren't here for landscaping updates. They came to see the war unfold. Barbara wasted no time. "We'll call this meeting to order." The first agenda item, disciplinary review of resident Logan Parker. Gasps from the crowd. No surprise. Barbara slid a document across the table, her fingers white with pressure. "You've been issued multiple warnings. You continue to violate the HOA's visual guidelines. This notice is a formal fine. If unpaid, legal escalation will follow." Logan didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice or posture. He simply leaned forward and asked calmly, "May I speak?" Barbara sneered. Briefly, he reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone. "I figured we'd get here," he said, voice steady as concrete. "So I brought backup." The phone screen glowed. A video began to play, directly from a U.S. government housing resource site. A clear voice narrated federal protections for active duty service members, specifically under the Service Members Civil Relief Act, which prohibits discrimination in housing, including HOA policies that unfairly target or penalize military attire or status. Silence. Barbara's jaw tensed. "That's irrelevant," she snapped. "Our community is a private organization. Our rules do not supersede federal law." Logan cut in, his voice not loud, but unshakable. Edwin Henderson cleared his throat, visibly sweating. "Barbara, did we verify this before issuing the fine?" "It's about aesthetics," she barked. "Not patriotism. This is about visual order." Logan stood up slowly, not to intimidate, but because he wasn't finished. "You can dress up your control as standards all you want. But let's call it what it is, discrimination. I wore this uniform in a combat zone so you could sip Chardonnay behind gates. And now you want to punish me for it." The room was no longer on Barbara's side. Susan Gardner, the once silent lapdog, glanced nervously around before whispering, "Barbara, I think we should reconsider." But Logan wasn't done. He pulled out another document, this one not a law, but a ledger. "Also," he said casually, "a friend of mine from the base legal office took an interest in our situation. We ran the HOA's expense reports from the last 3 years." He paused. "And we found discrepancies." Barbara paled. Mason, seated beside him, leaned back with a satisfied smirk. Turns out, HOA funds, meant for maintenance, repairs, community events, were rerouted to cover luxury purchases. Trips to Arizona, catering receipts from a spa retreat. Guess whose name's on all of them? Gasps again. Barbara stammered, then lunged for the binder as if she could somehow erase it all. "You're bluffing," she shouted. But Logan simply placed the document on the table. "I don't bluff. I declassify." The room erupted, not in chaos, but in a murmured wave of realization. Barbara wasn't a leader. She was a tyrant with a closet full of skeletons and a file full of receipts. Edwin stood. "I moved to strike the fine from the record." Susan followed. "I second." Barbara's eyes burned with fury. "You're letting him win?" Mason chuckled. "No, Barbara. You lost all on your own." The vote passed. Charges dropped. Case closed. Barbara stood, her hands trembling as she gathered her precious clipboard like a broken shield. She didn't slam the door when she left, but everyone could hear it break. For most people, a public humiliation in front of your entire neighborhood would be the end of it. A warning. A final chapter. But Barbara Evans was not most people. The very next morning, she was back at it, furiously typing on her laptop at the front porch table, a fresh stack of flyers at her side, and an expression so tense it could have snapped steel. Defeat wasn't an option in her mind. Not for someone who had once declared at a neighborhood potluck that she ran this place tighter than Fort Knox. And certainly not after being publicly overruled by the very board she built from fear and folded arms. Her weapon of choice now? Propaganda. By mid-afternoon, laminated flyers appeared on mailboxes and porch rails like disease warnings. Attention. Protect Brookstone Ridge aesthetic values. Stand against uniform aggression. Each was accompanied by stock photos of vague, non-compliant behavior, including a poorly edited silhouette of a soldier walking a dog. Barbara had even crafted a new HOA amendment, one she'd clearly typed in a rush, judging by the triple spacing and excessive use of bolded words like intimidation and community safety. Logan simply raised an eyebrow when Mason showed him the flyer. "She's doubling down on crazy," Mason muttered. "No," Logan corrected, "she's trying to save face. Problem is, she's already lost it." But what Barbara didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that the community she had lorded over for nearly a decade was no longer silent. The neighbors had seen enough. Over the next 2 days, the emails poured in, not to Barbara, but to the HOA board itself. From the retired schoolteacher who had been fined for painting her door sky blue. From the young couple who had been threatened for placing solar panels on their roof. From the Korean War vet who had removed a dead tree himself and been hit with a $300 violation. They had stories. And now, thanks to Logan, they had courage. It wasn't long before Mason got a message from Sophia Daniels, the soft-spoken mother of 3 who rarely spoke up in meetings. "I'm organizing a vote to dissolve the current HOA leadership. You and your brother started something, and we're finishing it." The vote was legal, buried in the HOA bylaws that Barbara had weaponized for years but apparently never read all the way through. A recall clause, Section 8F, allowed for a leadership vote with 60% resident approval. And the signatures came fast. By the end of the week, Barbara's office was surrounded, metaphorically and literally. Neighbors passed out recall forms. Some even stood outside her home holding handmade signs. Real unity over rules, and no more Queen Barbara. She called the police. They laughed, gently. She emailed the HOA's legal counsel. They didn't respond. She even tried going door to door, pleading with elderly residents like a fallen monarch begging for loyalty. But it was over. At the emergency meeting held under the fading light of a Friday evening, Barbara sat at the far end of the community center table, the clipboard noticeably absent. Her voice was hoarse, her eyes shadowed with sleepless defiance. Sophia Daniels stood at the podium. "We're not here to attack," she began. "We're here to rebuild. We believe in community, not control. And we believe Logan Parker, a man who served this country, deserves to wear his uniform without being targeted." There was no argument, no shouting, just the raising of hands, one after another. A silent wave of resolve. Barbara didn't even wait for the final count. She stood, muttered something about ungrateful brats, and stormed out again. But this time, she didn't slam the door. This time, she left it open behind her. Barbara Evans didn't throw a farewell party. She didn't send a last-minute newsletter. She didn't even leave a note. But the residents of Brookstone Ridge didn't need a formal announcement. The moving truck on Ash Grove Lane said it all. Logan spotted it first from the front porch, the dusty white rental with a faded "We Move Fast" decal and a single worker struggling to maneuver Barbara's antique armoire through her narrow doorway. She stood at the edge of the lawn, arms crossed, barking directions with all the authority of someone who used to matter. Mason joined him moments later, holding 2 cups of coffee. "I thought she'd go down screaming." Logan sipped from the mug. "She already did." No one was listening. Across the street, neighbors peeked from behind curtains, but there was no hostility in their gaze. No smugness. Just quiet relief. A collective exhale from a community that had, for too long, lived under the microscope of HOA tyranny. Barbara caught their eyes once, just once, and in that frozen second, time seemed to rewind. All the warnings, the fines, the meetings with clipped tones and weaponized regulations, they flashed in the air like ghosts. Logan gave a respectful nod. Mason offered a polite wave. Barbara said nothing. She turned, stepped into the cab, and was gone before sunset. And with her departure came something else. Freedom. That weekend, Brookstone Ridge looked different, not physically, but spiritually. The usual tension in the air had dissolved. Lawns still looked pristine, yes, but now you could hear music drifting from open windows. Someone installed a porch swing that creaked cheerfully in the breeze. A little girl ran through a sprinkler barefoot, giggling. And nobody came by with a clipboard. But the real celebration came Sunday afternoon. Logan's idea. No fancy banners. No speeches. Just a long table on his front lawn stacked with food, folding chairs borrowed from half the neighborhood, and a simple handwritten sign that read, "Unity over uniformity, everyone welcome." And they came. Not just the neighbors who had signed the petition, but the quiet ones too, the ones who'd spent years keeping their heads down, afraid to hang a wind chime or fly a flag without permission. The ones who had nodded along with Barbara's rules because resistance had always felt futile. They brought potato salads and pies. They brought stories, some funny, others infuriating. But most of all, they brought community. Sophia Daniels gave a toast, not with champagne, but with sweet tea in a red Solo cup. To Logan, she said, for reminding us that rules should never come before respect. Everyone clinked plastic and laughed. Even Edwin Henderson, once Barbara's right-hand man, stood beside the grill flipping burgers with Logan like old friends. When a teenager approached Logan to ask if his camouflage was real, Logan knelt, smiled, and said, "Every stitch." Mason, watching from his lawn chair, couldn't help but grin. "What are you thinking?" Logan asked, dropping into the chair beside him. "That this story's going to outlive all of us," Mason said. "They'll be telling their grandkids about the guy who took down a tyrant just by wearing his uniform." Logan laughed, a full, honest sound that hadn't echoed from his chest in years. "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe they'll just remember the barbecue." Mason nodded. "Both work." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting Brookstone Ridge in a soft amber glow, Logan leaned back, arms behind his head. No more fines. No more threats. No more battles in his own backyard. He had fought in foreign lands for peace. Now, finally, he had found it at home. And that, more than any medal, was the victory he hadn't known he needed.